All right, guys, thanks for tuning in today. On my back deck, I forgive the neighbor's dog barking. She thinks I'm gonna come play with her and give her treats or something. But today, I'm gonna ruffle some feathers. We're gonna be talking about arrow weight, basically overall weight. There's a really big trend right now in extremely heavy arrows, especially with a ton of weight up front. And over the years working at the bow rack and talking to a lot of people who've shot anything from a 700 grain arrow down to a 405 grain arrow, I've been able to develop a pretty good opinion on this, and I just kind of want to share this with you guys because I think there's a few channels and influencers or whatever you want to call them out there right now that are promoting this extremely heavy arrow weight, and it's really just in my opinion, kind of a band-aid for it's not even a band-aid, it's actually a detriment to your accuracy. And what I mean by that is, so any arrow, whether it be light, heavy, whatever, it has to hit something vital in order to kill an animal, right? In my experience, these arrows that are coming in, and when I say heavy, I'm talking 600 plus grains, which that sounds like a lot. You may be thinking like, oh, nobody's shooting an arrow that heavy. I see it every day. Guys are coming in with these extremely heavy setups. And you still have to hit something vital in order to kill an animal. If I have a 700 grain arrow and I misjudge the yardage by 3 yards at 40 yards, I'm probably gonna hit low. Even if my line is perfect, I'm gonna blow right through the brisket. It's not gonna hit anything vital. And then cool, like you just wounded an animal with a heavy arrow. Like the animal's not gonna die. And when you start sacrificing forgiveness and accuracy in your setup just for penetration, I think there's kind of a disconnect there, because if I always want to believe that when I'm hunting, I'm going to have time to range every animal that comes in. And I think this pertains especially to Western hunters. That is not the case. Lots of times you get to range, if I'm elk hunting, I'll range a bush here, a tree there, a stump there, whatever it is. So I've got a few different yardage markers. If that animal is coming in and I'm like, oh, he's coming, right at that tree, he's gonna be 35 yards. And then that bull turns and follows a cow somewhere between the stump I ranged at 35 and the tree I ranged at 60. If I think he's now 45, but he's actually 49, a really heavy arrow is not gonna give you any forgiveness in that. If I have my sight set for 45 and that animal's 49, a 650, 700 grain arrow is gonna drop significantly in that 4 or 5 yards. Whereas a lighter arrow is probably only gonna hit 3 or 4 inches low. So I'm not gonna say speed is accuracy, but speed is forgiveness to a certain extent. Now I'm not saying by any means that you should go shoot a 380 grain arrow at an elk, but you have to recognize that arrow weight is very dependent on your draw length and draw weight. If somebody comes in and they have a 32.5 inch draw length and they're pulling 70, 75, 80 pounds, then sure, a 550, 575 grain arrow is not overly heavy because they have a lot of horsepower behind it. But if somebody comes in with a 27 inch draw length, they're gonna get 0 yardage out of their sight tape. They'd be lucky to get 60 yards out of their sight. The gap between their pins is so big that, if they're gap shooting, it's like, meaning, if it's 50, let's say 45 yards and I'm aiming between my 40 and 50, it's much harder to center where you want to hit between a gap that's this big versus a gap that's this big. So again, it comes down to forgiveness in your sight. On top of that, like I mentioned earlier, you still have to hit something vital. So a really slow, heavy arrow, let's say, and especially here in Western Oregon, a lot of times you're hunting in reprod where there's a 7, 8, 9 foot ceiling. If I have a bull standing there at 35 yards and I have to aim like this to get it there, chances are I'm gonna clip a branch on the way there. Or if I got a tight window, I want a flatter shooting arrow. For example, this is the arrow I'm shooting this year. It's a 300 spine X impact. It's got 180 grains up front, which I don't calculate FOC, it's whatever. It's got some good FOC, it's probably like 14%. But it's 462 grains, it's going 290 feet a second out of my bow. I was in Maui a few weeks ago and shot a doe that was downhill from me. hit her a little bit high, right in the spine, blew completely through her spine. The nock and the fletch were sticking out the backside of her, and she dropped immediately. I think penetration comes a lot more down to the tune of your bow, meaning how that arrow is flying and the angle that arrow is at when it hits the animal, and then obviously having a good broadhead. If your arrow comes out of the bow like this, and when it hits the animal, it's kicked one way or another, you're gonna lose a ton of energy. And your arrows, when it hits, it's gonna take a direction one way or the other. If your bow is tuned well and that arrow is flying straight, whatever it hits, that energy is gonna get translated directly into the target or the animal. You know, I know so many guys who've blown through elk with a 420 grain arrow, and it's because it's a well-tuned bow, it's good shot placement, and you know, they had a good mark on their sight. Now, like I said, I don't promote a really, really light arrow. Generally speaking, depending on your draw length, you know, I like to see arrows somewhere, anywhere between like 445 grains. Like if you're a shorter draw length, and we'll just say pulling 70 pounds. If you're a shorter draw length, an arrow between, say, 27 inches on your draw length, an arrow between, you know, 440 and 460, I think is really good. I usually I shoot an arrow somewhere in that like 480 to 500 range, because I'm a 30-inch draw length, 70, 75 pounds, depending on my setup. It's always worked well for me. I decided to go a little bit lighter this year and just see how it worked, and the 2 animals I shot in Hawaii were a pretty good indicator. It worked really, really well. The arrow never checked up, got great blood trails, it was accurate. That doe that I shot, she was in some, these are axis deer, and she was in these real tall, like, kind of look like cattails, but they have like these puffy balls instead of those long like stalks. And I was trying to range her through there, and it kept saying, you know, I'd hit the stalk of something, it'd be like 27, 36, 42, 36. So I ended up ranging a log that I could see behind her, and it said 42. I judged her for like 36. She was probably more like 30. She was probably more like 32 or 33, to be honest, because, you know, I held right behind her shoulder and I hit high. Now, a really heavy arrow in that situation would have had a lot more arc, and I probably would have missed her clean. So, like I said, this, in my opinion, and I'm just going to throw some random numbers out here. If somebody comes in 70 pounds, pulling, you know, 27 to 28 inches, I'm probably going to put you in an arrow that weighs somewhere between 440 and 465 grains. If you're in that like 28 and a half to, or 27 and a half to 29 range, 28 to 29 range, I'm going to probably put you in an arrow that's somewhere between like, you know, 450 and 480. Once you hit that 30 plus range, then you, in my opinion, like, you can easily shoot a 500 grain arrow, still get good trajectory, so you get that forgiveness out of your sight tape, and it's going to hit just as hard. I know everybody's going to be watching this and saying, oh, Ashby and Ranch Fairy, like, it's all about the math. I know the math. The math is not very complicated. Momentum, which is what carries your arrow through an animal, is mass times velocity. So if you increase your mass, that decreases your velocity, you're going to usually stay about the same momentum. If you increase your arrow weight by, you know, 35 grains, let's say, you're not going to gain that much more momentum, but you are going to lose a lot on your sight tape. On the flip side of that, if I increase my velocity but decrease my mass a little bit, I'm going to have a lighter arrow, but it's moving much faster, and when it hits, that speed is going to help carry it through an animal. So it's about finding that balance, right? It's about finding that happy medium, in my opinion. Like I said, I do not promote an incredibly light arrow. I don't promote an incredibly heavy arrow. Watching some guys, and you know, these guys that shoot really heavy arrows, you know, shooting them out of like a whisker biscuit, and you know, like, their bow is obviously not tuned, because you watch it in slow motion and the arrow comes out and it's like and does this all the way to the target. So when it hits, it's not going straight. Obviously you're not going to get good penetration. So if you really want good penetration, find a shop that knows how to tune your bow right. Don't just put a band-aid on it with a super heavy arrow. In my opinion, sacrificing accuracy for weight or penetration is not a very good way to go about things. If you look on, you know, if you follow any professional archers, you're not going to find a single person that shoots a 255 grain insert and broadhead with a 650 grain piss missile. You just aren't. Levi Morgan blew clean through a moose at 25 yards with a 425 grain arrow because his bow is tuned well and he knows how to shoot it. And he hit the moose perfectly. So again, it comes down to hitting something vital, which you have a worse chance of with an extremely heavy arrow, and a bow that is tuned well. So that arrow is flying straight when it hits the animal and not kicked one direction or the other. So like I said, this video is gonna ruffle some feathers, but I've had experience with heavy arrows, light arrows, everything in between. And people say, well, what if you hit a shoulder blade? Whatever. Like, you can have a perfect example. Cam Haynes, last year, he shoots 90 pounds with a 540 some grain arrow. He had a bull coming in, quartered to him, was gonna try to tuck it right, you know, just right behind the shoulder. Hit a little bit right, basically hit it right in the, you know, right in dead center of the shoulder. Did not get through. That bull ran 85 yards. He heard it, but it didn't get through and kill it. That bull ran like 85 yards and stopped and was able to get another arrow in it and kill it. But you're not getting through the shoulder blade of an elk or anyway, with pretty much any arrow. And I've blown through shoulder blades of deer with a 450 grain arrow, and I'm not sure a 700 and something grain arrow would have done any better. Like, it still died, right? So anyway, that's my take on on these arrows. I do think FOC helps. You know, I think anything over 11% is good, but when you start getting into that 20, 22, 23%, you really sacrifice flight characteristics of your arrow. And you can watch it. I mean, if you're watching a spot and scope with somebody shooting an arrow that's got 250 grains up front, it gets to about, depending on your setup, you know, it gets just past that 60-yard mark, and then like there's not enough to stabilize. You got to have the velocity still in order for the vanes to do enough to stabilize that arrow. So I hope you guys don't hate me too much for saying this. Be careful. Be careful what you look at online, just like in anything. And I'm not gonna say that I'm completely right on this. And I know there's gonna be a lot of you that send me messages on, you know, the math of momentum and weight forward and all this stuff. And I've read it. I've read Ashby's report. I've watched Ranch Fairy. I get it, okay? All that stuff sounds great on paper. I go by results. I look at everybody that comes in, shows pictures of the elk they shot, the broadhead they shot them with, the arrow they shot them with, their setup, this, that. And over the years, I've seen a trend. So hope I didn't ruffle your feathers too much. If you have a chance, head on over to InsideOutPrecision.com, pick yourself up some merch. We really appreciate all the support. And as usual, remember, precision is a decision. Keep them in the middle. I'll see you on the range. Or in the woods, actually. It's almost hunting season.